When you think about Antarctic exploration, your mind probably jumps straight to the heroic age. You know, Shackleton trapped in the ice, Scott racing for the pole.
All those iconic, dramatic stories.
Exactly. But way before them, really in the shadow of the Napoleonic Wars, there was this other breed of explorer. They were ruthless, they were intensely competitive, and they were sailing, quite literally, off the edge of the known map.
And one name just dominates that entire era, even if the man himself often gets overlooked. James Weddell.
That's our focus for today. His name is everywhere in the South, the Weddell Sea, the Weddell Seal. But the story of the man is, well, it's often just a footnote.
It really is. So today we are doing a deep dive into this really complex figure. This is the story of a completely self-made man who went from committing a crime that was basically mutiny.
A huge deal.
A huge deal, to becoming the world record holder for the farthest south voyage. And he held that record for decades.
So our mission today is to trace that incredible arc. How did the brutal economic need to hunt for seals drive a man to a navigational feat that was 3 whole degrees of latitude beyond the great Captain Cook?
We're going to follow his path from the really gritty merchant service and his intense financial struggles, all the way to that record latitude of 74 degrees, 15 minutes south, and then look at the fallout that followed.
And to do that, we've got a pretty detailed stack of sources to work from.
We do. We're relying on some fantastic biographical material. We've looked at his official Royal Navy service records, his own published accounts of the voyage, which are fascinating in themselves.
Of course.
And maybe most revealing of all, we've dug into historical documents about his legal and financial fights with his sponsors.
Ah, that's where the real story is.
That's where you see it all. It's in those records of debt and disagreement that you get the full, unvarnished picture of this immense tension between, scientific curiosity and just ruthless 19th century commerce.
So, James Weddell's life, it really begins completely immersed in the sea. It's not a choice for him. It's just his reality from day one.
Literally from birth. He was born in Austin, which is on the Belgian coast, on August 24, 1787, and his father was a Scottish sea captain.
And in that era, it wasn't uncommon for captains to have their families on board, was it?
Not at all. They were often permitted to have their wives sailing with them. So you have to imagine, Weddell's first memories wouldn't be of a house or a garden. They would be the constant roll of the deck, the smell of salt, the sound of the rigging.
That kind of childhood, or lack of one, it must have pushed him into a professional life incredibly early.
Exceptionally. He basically skipped a traditional childhood altogether. He was apprenticed as a seaman very, very young. Now, for some context here, maritime apprenticeship back then usually started around age 8.
8 years old.
8 years old. And when you're 8 and you're learning how to handle ropes and take orders on a working ship, well, formal schooling just isn't part of the equation.
So he misses out on a standard education, but he wasn't illiterate. And that's a really key point for a man who would later become such a meticulous navigator.
That's the crucial distinction. The sources are clear. He got very little formal education, but he could read and he could write. That literacy, combined with what was obviously a sharp intelligence and a real capacity for self-study, that became the ladder he used to climb his way up.
Let's talk about that first rung on the ladder, because his initial career was, let's say, far from glamorous.
Oh, not at all. He started in what was probably the toughest school imaginable for a sailor at the time, the Newcastle collier trade.
What did that actually involve? It sounds brutal.
It was. His first years were spent bound to the master of a Newcastle collier. Now, for anyone listening who isn't familiar, a collier was a coal transport ship. They ran up and down the really unforgiving east coast of Britain.
So, terrible weather, heavy ships.
Exactly. Heavy, blunt, incredibly difficult ships to handle, sailing in some of the worst weather in the world. It was the absolute crucible of British seamanship, demanding, dangerous, and just incredibly rough. It was a world of hard knocks.
An environment where discipline is probably enforced with your fists.
Precisely. There's no room for niceties there.
Yeah.
Around 1805, he moves on from that and ships aboard a merchantman trading to the West Indies. He makes several voyages there.
Which is a step up, navigationally speaking.
A big step up. It gives him that crucial deep sea experience. But he's still very much in the merchant world. It's all about cargo. It's all about profit. It's a winnowed away from the regulated scientific hierarchy of the Royal Navy.
And that brings us to 1808. This is the moment, the crisis, that completely redirects his life. That rough merchant service culture, it boils over.
It does. There's a confrontation, and Weddell strikes his captain. Now, you have to understand, in the context of maritime law at the time, this was a profoundly serious crime.
It's basically mutiny.
It is. On the high seas in the 19th century, striking your captain attacked the very core of authority on a ship. Discipline was absolute because it had to be for survival. He could have faced a very long prison sentence, maybe even worse.
But the punishment he got, ironically, turns into the biggest break of his career. He's handed over to the Royal Navy.
It's an incredible twist of fate.
Why would the Navy even want him? A troublemaker from the merchant fleet.
Manpower. The Royal Navy, especially during the height of the Napoleonic Wars, was chronically short of experienced sailors. They had legal ways of, well, pressing men into service. For Weddell, this was a bizarre stroke of luck disguised as a punishment. He enters the structured world of the Navy, but as a prisoner.
And during that time in confinement, he doesn't just sit there. He uses the time he never had as a child apprentice.
This is the essence of James Weddell. He's a self-improver. He uses his prison time to study navigation intensely. He's finally translating all that rough, hands-on experience into formal mathematical knowledge.
So when he's released,
He immediately joins the Royal Navy as a midshipman, and his rise is rapid. The move from a merchant seaman who assaulted his captain to a commissioned officer, eventually becoming a captain himself, is just astounding.
it really speaks to how good his self-taught skills must have been.
They had to be. The Navy might have prioritized pedigree, but they were desperate for competence, and Weddell had it in spades. By 1813, he's already serving aboard HMS Hope in the English Channel.
And we have records of what he was doing then, specific actions.
We do. There's a recorded highlight from that year. Aboard the Hope, he takes part in the capture of a small American privateer. It was called the Young True-Blooded Yankee,
Great name.
isn't it? But what it meant was he was a functioning, successful part of the war machine. He's gaining experience in naval command, in pursuit, and crucially, he's learning the incredibly high navigational and cartographic standards the Royal Navy demanded, far beyond anything in the merchant service.
So he's made it. He's a captain, a war veteran, a career officer. But then history gets in the way. The Napoleonic War ends.
And for a man like Weddell, that's a disaster. The end of the war in 1815 means massive demobilization. The British government doesn't need this huge navy anymore. So in February 1816, Weddell is laid off on half pay.
And half pay, for an officer with no independent wealth, that's not a comfortable retirement, is it?
Not even close. It's instant financial hardship. Half pay was basically a small retainer to keep you on the books, but it was nowhere near enough to live on, especially for an officer.
So what does he do?
He's forced to go right back to the merchant trade, sailing to the West Indies again just to make ends meet. It must have felt like such a bitter step backward. Then, by 1819, he's paid off entirely from the Royal Navy. The military career that saved him has now abandoned him. He's skilled, he's decorated, but he's financially stranded.
Okay, so Weddell is out of the Navy. He has this incredible high-level skill set in navigation and command, but he's broke. He needs to find a market for that expertise, and fast.
And he finds it in what has to be the most brutal, chaotic commercial venture of the entire 19th century, the Antarctic sealing rush.
It's a total pivot. This is the engine that drives all his exploration, isn't it? The need for cash.
Absolutely. He starts looking for patrons, for investors. In 1819, the very same year he's paid off, he connects with two really key figures. James Strachan, who was a big shipbuilder up in Northleith, and James Mitchell, a Scottish insurance broker based in London.
And what were these guys looking for?
High-risk, high-reward ventures. And Weddell had the perfect pitch for them.
What was the catalyst? What made them look south to the ice instead of, safer trade routes?
The catalyst was a piece of news that was like an earthquake in the shipping world. The rediscovery of the South Shetland Islands. Now, this wasn't just a little note on a map. This was the 19th century equivalent of a massive gold strike.
Because the reports said they were covered in seals.
Teeming with fur seals, their pelts were fetching astronomical prices in Europe and especially in the Chinese market.
So this isn't about science. It's not about discovery for its own sake. It's pure speculative commerce.
100%. And Weddell, with his Royal Navy background, he convinces them he can navigate these dangerous new waters better than any of the rough-and-tumble merchant captains. His pitch was simple. Fortunes might be made, and my naval skills will get us in fast, let us grab the seals, and get us out before the competition even gets there.
Let's talk about the ship they gave him, the vessel that becomes so linked to his name. The Jane.
The Jane. She was a 160-ton brig, and her own history is pretty fascinating. She was actually American built.
Oh, really?
Yes, captured by the British during the War of 1812, so she was a prize of war. And then Strachan refitted her specifically for the sealing trade. She needed to be fast, but also incredibly sturdy to handle the ice. She was perfect.
And that first voyage with the Jane, it goes well.
It's an immense success. It proves Weddell was completely right. That first gun to the Falklands and then further south, they came back with the holds just packed with valuable pelts.
The investors are happy.
They're ecstatic. The profits were so huge that they didn't just celebrate. They immediately doubled down. They funded the construction of a second, smaller ship, a cutter called the Beaufoy. They'd found their gold mine, and Weddell was the expert miner they needed.
So the stage is set for voyage number 2, from 1821 to 1822. He's commanding both ships now, the Jane and the Beaufoy, and they head back to the South Shetlands.
They head back to the epicenter of the boom.
But the boon is already starting to fade. The easy money they found just a year or two before, it's already gone.
It had evaporated. And this speaks to the terrifying speed of environmental collapse when you have unregulated commerce like this. They get back to the islands and they find the place has been stripped.
What was the scale of the operation down there? How many other ships were they competing with?
The sources are very clear on this, and it's staggering. Just 2 years after the islands were rediscovered, there were something like 45 sealing vessels all operating in that one small area at the same time. 45 ships. Can you imagine the chaos, the competition, the carnage? All of them hunting the same finite resource. The seals, in Weddell's own words, were already becoming rare. The gold rush had peaked, and it was already turning to bust.
So Weddell's purely commercial mission is now forced to become an exploratory one, just out of sheer desperation.
That's it exactly. The failure of the primary gold hunting seals drives the secondary achievement, which is geographical discovery. He has to scout new hunting grounds. If he can't find a new island, the expedition is a financial disaster.
And that desperation, that need, is what leads to the sighting of the South Orkney Islands.
Yes, on November 20th, 1821. And it's important to give credit where it's due here. While Weddell was the expedition commander, the actual first sighting was made by Michael McLeod, who was the captain of the smaller ship, the Beaufoy.
And this was a genuine discovery, a new landmass.
It was, previously unknown to Europeans. But even that moment of discovery, it just highlights the frantic pace of what was happening down there.
He wasn't the only one who saw it.
Not by a long shot. It was an independent discovery, but it was made only a few days after 2 other captains, an American named Nathaniel Palmer and a Brit named George Powell, had also sighted the islands.
So everyone was scrambling.
An absolute frenzy. Every captain down there knew that finding a new, untouched island could mean a fortune if you got there first. They managed to get some seals there before that population was also destroyed, and they sailed back to England, arriving in July 1822.
Okay, so we're heading into the third voyage, 1822 to 1824. Weddell's back on the Jane. Matthew Brisbane is in command of the Beaufoy. They know the known sealing grounds are pretty much exhausted, but they have to try.
They do. The investors have put up the money, the ships are ready, they feel they have to go back, so they return to the South Orkneys, but it's just as they feared. Sealing proves, again, really disappointing.
So they're searching, they're desperate.
They're burning through supplies and time. They spend weeks searching for new land between the South Shetlands and the South Orkneys, but they find nothing. And Weddell is facing this critical decision.
Turn back with empty holds and face his angry sponsors.
Or risk absolutely everything. Push the ships further south than any human had ever been on the long-shot gamble that they might find a new, untouched continent of seals.
A decision driven by commercial desperation, but also by an enormous stroke of luck with the weather.
The environmental factor here is you just can't overstate it. Normally, when we talk about Antarctic exploration, we're picturing ships being crushed in dense pack ice.
Right, the classic image.
Weddell encountered the complete opposite. His own logs describe the season as unusually mild and tranquil.
So what did that mean in practical terms? How did this anomaly change the game for him?
Well, normally that entire region, the Antarctic Circle, is choked with impassable sea ice. That's why Cook's record had stood for so long. But for Weddell, this mildness meant a huge ice-free sea opened up in front of him. He could sail south into a region that was normally a solid wall of ice.
So it wasn't just his skill, it was this unique, maybe once-in-a-century opportunity.
It was a perfect storm of skill-meeting opportunity, and he absolutely seized it.
Let's get to that moment. The moment he smashes the world record for farthest south. What are the specifics?
The date is February 20th, 1823. The two ships, the Jane and the Beaufoy, reached the coordinates 74 degrees 15 minutes south, 34 degrees 16 minutes 45 seconds west.
Okay, let's put that in perspective for everyone listening. How far south is that, really? And whose record did he just break?
He is an incredible 7.69 degrees south of the Antarctic Circle. That's about 532 statute miles further south than anyone had ever been. And the record he broke belonged to the legend, Captain James Cook. He didn't just beat Cook's record, he shattered it by 3 full degrees of latitude. It was almost unbelievable leap into the unknown.
And to navigate that accurately, so far south where a magnetic compass is starting to get unreliable, that's where his naval training and his equipment really matter.
This is where it all pays off. He was relying on celestial navigation. He's using sextants. He has his chronometers for longitude. He's doing meticulously calculated lunar distances. And these were the very expensive, high-precision instruments that, as we'll see, become the center of that legal fight later on.
Without them, he can't prove his claim.
He can't prove a thing. Without them, he never could have fixed his position at 74 degrees, 15 arrow S and had it authenticated.
So he's at this historic point, 500 miles deeper into the unknown than anyone has ever been. What does he see? Does he see a giant ice shelf? A continent?
This is what's so fascinating. His report is almost anticlimactic, but it's so important. He notes that they saw very few icebergs and, crucially, still no sight of land.
It's just open water.
Just an open, tranquil sea stretching to the southern horizon. And this leads him to a huge, and as it turns out, incorrect conclusion.
The open sea theory. He thinks he's found a navigable route to the South Pole.
That's exactly it. The lack of land leads him to theorize that the sea just continued, uninterrupted, all the way to the pole. He believed the Antarctic continent, if it existed, was probably just a collection of smaller islands, not one huge landmass. It completely challenged what most geographers at the time believed.
Which brings us to this kind of tragic irony of the story. The 48-hour what if.
It is the ultimate near miss of polar history. We know now, from modern maps, that if Weddell had just kept sailing south for 2 more days, maybe 48 hours longer, he would have seen land.
What land would he have seen?
He would have reached Coates Land, which is the eastern edge of the massive continent that lines the sea we now call the Weddell Sea. He was within striking distance of making one of the most significant geographical discoveries of the century.
So why did he turn back? After coming so far, setting the record, why not push on for just 2 more days?
Because the primary mission had failed. He'd set a navigational record, which was a huge personal achievement, but the commercial venture was a bust. There were no seals, the ships were running low on provisions, the Antarctic winter was approaching, and he knew he had to turn back to ensure his crew survived. Commerce trumped science.
And what was the long-term result of that decision to turn back in February 1823?
The consequences for our knowledge of the planet were just immense. Because his claim was so extraordinary and met with some skepticism, and because the area was so remote, no one else even attempted to get back there for nearly 90 years.
90 years.
Almost a century. That entire vast region was left completely unexplored until a German explorer, Wilhelm Filchner, finally reached the Filchner-Ronne ice shelf in 1911. Weddell's achievement, combined with his misleading open sea theory, effectively delayed our true understanding of that part of Antarctica for generations.
Wow. But before they turned back, he knew they had to mark the occasion. He had a crew of disappointed sealers who'd risked their lives for nothing. What did he do?
He was a smart commander. He knew morale would be at rock bottom, so he holds a ceremony not to celebrate finding seals, but to celebrate the navigational victory and, in his words, to dispel the gloom.
It's a great moment of leadership.
It is. He gathers the crews from both ships, announces that they are further south than any humans in history, and they have a formal celebration. They hoist the colors, they fire a ceremonial gun, both crews give 3 big cheers, and most importantly for the men, I'm sure, they were all given an extra allowance of grog.
A well-deserved draft.
Absolutely. It was a way of saying, we failed at our job, but we achieved something historic. He originally named the area the Sea of George IV after the king. Luckily for his legacy, that name didn't stick.
And it became the Weddell Sea. So the ceremony is over, the record is set. How does the rest of the voyage play out?
They head north, still desperately looking for seals on the way. They end up sheltering at South Georgia. They winter over in the Falklands to repair the ships. They make one last, fruitless attempt around the South Shetlands in late 1823. Finally, the ships separate in early 1824, and Weddell gets the Jane back to England in July, almost 2 full years after he'd left. The record was in the logbook, but the bank account was empty.
So Weddell gets back to England. He's a hero to some, but to others, his claim just seems too incredible to be true. He's beaten Cook's record by 3 entire degrees.
And that margin is exactly what caused some raised eyebrows, as the sources put it. The establishment found it very hard to swallow.
Why, though? What was the real issue?
Well, first, it was the sheer scale of it. It implied that a commercial sealer with no government backing had pulled off a feat of navigation that dwarfed the greatest state-sponsored explorers. Second, he'd sailed through a region where existing theories said there should be a continent, or, at the very least, impenetrable ice.
So he had an extraordinary claim, and he needed extraordinary evidence to back it up.
Exactly. And this is where his sponsors, Strachan and Mitchell, step in. They realize their failed business venture has accidentally produced this huge scientific breakthrough, and it needs to be authenticated.
They see a way to recoup some prestige, if not money.
That's right. They persuade Weddell to publish his accounts to get his logs and his navigational readings out there for scrutiny. His book, A Voyage Towards the South Pole, comes out in 1825.
Which is pretty quick.
Very quick. It was crucial for proving his claims. A second, bigger edition comes out in 1827, after the Beaufoy finally got back, which allowed him to add her logs and observations to strengthen his case even more.
And it's around this time that his name gets permanently stamped on the natural history of the region, too.
It does. The large seal he'd observed and documented in his voyages is officially named the Weddell Seal. So while his latitude claim was being debated, his biological observations were being confirmed. His mark on science was becoming undeniable.
So on the surface, he's a published author, a recognized naturalist and explorer. But underneath all that, his personal financial situation is just collapsing.
The contrast is just brutal. In the summer of 1826, when he should be celebrated, he's actually living in Edinburgh and gets cited for not paying a pretty significant debt.
How much was it?
It was 245 downs, which he'd been loaned by the commercial bank. To give you an idea of what that meant, in today's money, that's equivalent to about £26,000. This wasn't a forgotten bill. This was a major debt.
And he was trying to keep a low profile while this was happening.
It seems so. The records show his name isn't on any official directory in Edinburgh at the time, which strongly suggests he was, staying quietly with friends or family, trying to avoid the creditors.
And here's where the story gets really juicy. This debt seems to be directly linked to his greatest achievement. He has a major falling out with his sponsors, Strachan and Mitchell, over who's responsible for it.
The legal documents point to a complete breakdown in their relationship. They were arguing over who should pay for the expenses of a voyage that, from a commercial standpoint, had failed. And the coincidence here is just too perfect to ignore.
Go on.
The debt was for £245. The specialized navigational instruments that Weddell took on that record-breaking voyage cost £240.
Wow. So they're almost the exact same amount. The implication is that his sponsors saw the tools that made history as an unnecessary expense.
That is the clash of worlds in a nutshell. For the Leith merchants, it was all about the bottom line. A chronometer is great if it helps you find seals faster. But if the holds come back empty, they saw that £240 as a frivolous scientific luxury.
An extravagance.
Exactly. They likely argued that Weddell, the scientist, had overspent on fancy gear for what was supposed to be a simple hunt, and so the cost should be his problem, not theirs.
It's incredible, the difference between glory and failure, and the argument comes down to the cost of the tools that proved the glory.
It shows you that razor-thin line between commerce and science in that century. Weddell needed those instruments to prove he'd beaten Cook. The merchants just needed seals. No seals, and suddenly the instruments are a liability they want to get off their books.
And what's really ironic is that historians have since criticized him for the complete opposite reason.
Yes. Polar science historians like David Walton have argued that Weddell should have taken more instruments, not fewer. That to really do the science properly and convince a skeptical admiralty, he needed backups, redundancies, multiple chronometers.
So his sponsors are angry, he took what he did, and history thinks he didn't take enough. He's caught in the middle.
Perfectly caught. And the legal papers, frustratingly, they don't tell us who eventually paid the debt. We just know it caused him immense financial and reputational damage.
But even with all this mess, the debt, the public fight, the scientific world still saw the value in what he'd done.
They did. In February 1827, while all this is still going on, he's elected an ordinary fellow of the Royal Society of Edinburgh, and that was a huge deal.
What did that signify?
Well, being an ordinary fellow meant he had to be physically present in the city. It wasn't an honorary title. It was a clear signal that the Scottish scientific establishment respected him and his work. And his proposer was an admiral, Norwich Duff, which shows his standing in the naval community was still high.
So that fellowship was a kind of scientific validation that countered the commercial humiliation.
Absolutely. It confirmed that James Weddell the Navigator was the real deal. His record wasn't just some wild story from a desperate sealer. It was a legitimate landmark achievement in cartography and exploration.
So Weddell has his fellowship from the Royal Society of Edinburgh. His book is out. His record is, by now, pretty much accepted. His real passion was clearly exploration, not just hauling cargo.
Yeah.
Did he try to use this new scientific credibility to get back to the Antarctic?
Oh, he absolutely did. He knew he'd only just scratched the surface. He went directly to the Admiralty with a proposal. He laid out a plan for a dedicated scientific voyage back to the high southern latitudes to finally settle the question of the open polar sea and properly search for the landmass he'd missed.
This was his chance to go back as a scientist, not a sealer.
It was. But the Admiralty's response to the man who held the world record for farthest south?
They said no.
A flat rejection. It was a brutal blow. The British government was in peacetime mode. They were cutting budgets everywhere, and they just weren't going to fund a high-risk, expensive polar expedition based on the findings of a former commercial sealer.
So that door slammed shut, and he's forced back into the merchant trade.
Back to commercial trading, and not even in the exciting, high-risk areas. He's working routes along the warmer, safer Atlantic coast. It's a huge step down from his ambitions.
That rejection is a real turning point. If the Admiralty had said yes, who knows what he might have found? Instead, his life seems to just spiral into a series of disasters at sea, starting with the loss of his famous ship, the Jane.
The loss of the Jane in 1829 is really the final hammer blow. It cements his financial ruin. He's her master again, sailing a commercial route from Buenos Aires to Gibraltar. But the ship is old. She's probably been pushed too hard for too long.
She starts to leak.
Severely. So badly that they have to abandon her at the Azores. That's a catastrophic loss right there. The ship is gone. The cargo is gone.
And it gets even worse for him personally, doesn't it? The ordeal isn't over.
Not by a long shot. It's just a harrowing sequence of bad luck. Weddell and what little cargo they saved are transferred to a second ship to continue the journey to England. And then that ship runs aground on the island of Pico.
Unbelievable.
The sources say that Weddell himself only barely survived, so within the space of a few weeks he loses 2 ships, nearly loses his own life, and is left with absolutely nothing.
So the loss of the Jane, that means he's no longer an entrepreneur or a partner in these ventures. He's just a guy with debts.
It's completely devastating. It meant total financial ruin. He has to abandon any idea of being a ship owner or an expedition leader. He's forced to just take paid employment as a ship's master to earn a wage, just to survive.
He goes from James Weddell, the explorer, to Captain Weddell, a hired hand.
A hired hand on someone else's ship. And his final recorded assignment, it takes him about as far away from the Antarctic as you can get.
Where did he go?
In September 1830, he leaves England as the master of a ship called the Eliza. It was a long, grueling commercial run out to the new Swan River colony in Western Australia, and from there on to Tasmania.
Just hauling goods back and forth.
For 2 years. It's such a stark contrast to his earlier life, chasing latitude records in the pristine Antarctic.
He finally gets back to England in 1832. And the last couple of years of his life, they don't seem to be very happy ones.
No, they seem to have been spent in decline, both financially and physically. He died quite soon after returning to London on September 9th, 1834. He was only 47 years old.
And where he died really tells you everything about how his story ended.
It does. He died in his house on Norfolk Street, just off the Strand in London. It was a respectable address, but a very ordinary one. He was known in scientific circles, of course, but he certainly wasn't a celebrity or a wealthy man. The picture is of someone who died in quiet obscurity.
His fame and his fortune just completely extinguished by bad luck and bad business. And he's buried right there in London.
Very close to where he died, in the churchyard of St. Clement Danes in the Strand. A simple city burial for a man whose name is attached to one of the most vast, dramatic, and remote oceans on the entire planet. It just underscores the tragedy. He gave the world this monumental discovery, and his own life ended in a way that was far less famous, far less affluent than his achievements deserved. Hashtag outro. When you really look at the full arc of Weddell's life, from that boy on a collier to a fellow of the Royal Society, you just see the story of a man who was driven by incredible talent, but also just haunted by incredible bad luck.
And despite all that tragedy in his final years, his legacy is literally written on the map of the world. It's permanent.
It really is. I mean, three major geographic features in the far south have his name. There's the huge Weddell Sea, of course. There are the Weddell Islands in the South Orkneys, and another Weddell Island in the Falklands,
And the seal?
and the Weddell Seal. His name is forever part of the natural history of the region, a direct result of his detailed observations back in the 1820s.
So when we step back, what does this whole deep dive into his life really tell us? For me, Weddell's story is the perfect, maybe the most brutal, illustration of that constant tension between scientific discovery and 19th century capitalism.
That's the core of it, isn't it? His navigational genius was only ever unleashed because of a desperate hunt for profit. But those very same commercial forces are what ultimately destroyed him.
The quest for seals drove him 3 degrees beyond Cook. But then the economics of it all, the debt, the fight with his sponsors over those instruments, the Admiralty turning him down, and then losing his ship. It all conspired to not only ruin him, but to actively shut down any chance of a scientific follow-up.
He was a commercial explorer whose greatest legacy became purely scientific, and it was an achievement born from a complete and utter business failure. And that, I think, leads us to the final provocative thought we want to leave you with today. Just think about this. In 1823, James Weddell theorized that there was an open sea leading all the way to the South Pole. He was turned down for funding to go back and check, partly because of skepticism and partly because of the controversy over the cost of his navigational gear.
Gear that cost 240 pounds.
Right. Given that the area he sailed into wasn't properly explored again by a scientific expedition until 1911, almost 90 years later, you have to ask, how much did that petty financial squabble over instruments that cost less than a cheap modern car? How much did that one argument delay our true scientific understanding of the Antarctic continent? Maybe by nearly a century. It's a staggering thought about the real cost of putting commerce before curiosity,